Welcome everyone to our deep dive webinar on overcoming barriers to the clean energy transition. We can get started with a bit of an introduction on the next slide. If this is your first time, my name is Kristen Suarez. My pronouns are she, they, and I am the State Climate Policy Network Manager here at Climate Exchange. You can learn more about the SCPN's programming, Climate Exchange's research, and more at the link I just sent in the chat, which is climate-exchange.org/network. And then on the next slide, in case it's your first time joining us, Climate Exchange is a national organization focused on passing effective and equitable climate policy at the state level. So the SCPN is one of our main national programs for supporting state work here at CXC, but we are a network of over 15,000 advocates, legislators, researchers, government officials, business leaders, all sorts of folks working in and around state level climate policy across all 50 states. And if this is your first time engaging with the SCPN, I just sent that link in the chat. And that link will lead you to recordings and recap articles from past webinars, which are, part of our roughly monthly deep dive webinar series where we delve into a specific topic relevant to state level climate policy. And we invite experts to share their experience and knowledge. And through these events, as well as our monthly national SCPN calls, which the next of which is happening next week on Wednesday, we really hope to create a space for network members to connect on climate policy, learn from the vast knowledge and experience that's held within this national network. So please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I will send my email in the chat, and we can move to the next slide just to kind of show you a few ways we can support you and your work, or we can connect you to someone who can. And you can just email me if you are interested in taking advantage of any of these things. But Climate Exchange specializes in tracking and analyzing state level climate policy, as well as providing connections with experts, advocates, peers in the field working on similar issues. We can provide example states for climate policies, state landscape analyses, and more, all pro bono. And then on our website, you can also find our state climate policy dashboard, which is a free tool that tracks enacted state level climate policies across 7 major climate sectors across all 50 states. And then now, last slide before we get into our presentation today. On Monday of this week, we launched our first ever network-wide survey aimed to better understand the needs of our vast audience. We're at a really exciting time here at the SCPN, a lot of growth happening, and we really want to make sure that we scale up our offerings in a way that meets your real needs. So it's a 10 to 15 minute survey. And by completing the survey, you will be entered into a raffle to win one of 15 $50 e-gift cards. So please, if you have benefited from our services in any way, please feel free to just, take 10 minutes and fill that out and let us know how we're doing and what we can do to better support your work. And we can go on to the next slide and really get into today's call now. We've invited an amazing panel of speakers to talk about what states need to know about where we're at in the clean energy transition and how we move forward from here. And before I introduce our speakers, just a logistical note, people are in the chat box, and that's great. Feel free to use that as a space for connection. Drop interesting resources in there, your email, if you want to connect with anyone. But if you have any topic-related questions for the panelists, please submit those at any time through the Q&A feature, the button at the bottom of your screen. If you submit them through the chat, they might get lost. But panelists might be able to see and respond to them, or at the throughout the event, or at the end, time permitting, however long our Q&A portion can be. And then this webinar is being recorded, so if you have to hop off at any time, feel free to do that. We'll be sharing slides and recording by email, as well as a recap article summarizing the main points of these presentations by the end of the week. So we have these 4 amazing speakers, and after each of them have presented, we'll start that Q&A portion. But we're going to start with Hannah Hess. We'll be looking at clean energy deployment to date from various federal climate funding programs, and then we'll move into Charles and Harper and Daniela Schulman's presentation on state siting and permitting, and then we'll move to David Sarkisian's presentation on grid modernization. So very exciting agenda for today. I'm gonna go to the next slide, and we can hand it over to Hannah Hess, who is an associate director with Rhodium Group's energy and climate practice, overseeing project related to Rhodium's work estimating the cost of climate change as part of the Climate Impact Lab. And I will hand it over to you, Hannah. We can go to the next slide and start your presentation. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for your attention today and the opportunity to be here. Shout out to the Colorado folks. I'm joining from Denver. And I'm going to, as Kristen said, set the stage for today's discussion with sort of a how are we doing on the deployment of clean energy and transportation. Next slide, please. So on the left of this slide, you see projections from the paper Emissions and Energy Impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was published in the journal Science last summer. The authors all independently modeled possible US emissions scenarios under implementation of the IRA and the bill. And you see the results are broadly in line with the stated objective of the IRA, that the legislation would help the US achieve a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030 below 2005 levels. So together, these laws contain funding for the power grid, EV charging, energy storage, clean hydrogen, carbon capture, and many other climate investments. And they also direct billions of dollars of funding to tax credits, grants, and federal lending authority to reduce carbon emissions. So as we all well know on this call, these represent the largest public investment in clean energy and transportation in US history, and they're designed to incentivize far larger private investment and achieve goals such as promoting domestic supply chains. So that brings me to the Clean Investment Monitor, or the CIM as we like to call it, which was launched last fall by Rhodium Group and MIT's Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. The CIM tracks deployment in the real world. Our database begins tracking clean investments in 2018, setting a historical baseline, and includes tens of thousands of individual manufacturing facilities, millions of ZEV registrations, millions of heat pump sales, millions of distributed electricity or storage installations, and so on. Among the CIM's goals is comparing on-the-ground progress on clean energy deployment with projections of the impacts of these laws that were developed shortly after their adoption. Next slide, please. Here, what we're looking at is 3 studies that did just that, looked at the projected impacts of these bills. Specifically, we're looking at an overview of reports by Energy Innovation, the Repeat Project at Princeton Group, and Rhodium. Princeton University and Rhodium Group. A note on methods here. In the last column, you see that there are ranges. When you see, I just want to speak to Rhodium in particular, when you see ranges there, it reflects a diversity of outcomes that are based on where oil and gas prices are, clean technology costs, and overall GDP growth. So it's not sensitivity within the implementation of the IRA, it's all those factors. And this modeling includes all of the federal and state policy that was on the books as of June 2023, including the IRA. What do all these models say? Implementing the IRA puts the US on track for greenhouse gas reductions in 2030 that are 37 to 42% below 2005 levels. And the main pathways the US has to reach those 2030 climate goals are taking advantage of solutions that are already mature. So, and address emissions from the 2 highest emitting sectors, transportation and power. So the joint analysis I'll be walking through today compared actual progress in 2022 and 2023 deployment of zero emissions vehicles and clean electricity as tracked within the CIM database to these model projections. The takeaway, hopefully relevant to all of you on the call who are doing such crucial policy work at the state level, at the local level, and at the federal level, is to better understand the magnitude of additional policies and private sector actions that are needed to narrow implementation gaps. Next slide, please. So first up, transportation, good news. How do actual sales of, here we're defining ZEVs as battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid vehicles, and fuel cell vehicles. How do they track to the projections? Well, they've actually been pacing somewhat faster than forecast, which might be surprising given the past several months of news stories suggesting that the US is experiencing a slowdown in EV sales. But in 2023, we came in at the top end of the range of post-IRA projections at 9.2%. And based on preliminary 2023 data from the SIM, we're estimating that 1.43 million ZEVs were sold in the US in 2023. And it's worth noting, another hurrah here. These levels dramatically exceeded projections from just a few years ago before the IRA passed. So in 2020, for example, the Energy Information Administration projected 580,000 ZEV sales in 2023, which is a little more than a third of what actually occurred last year. Next slide, please. Now let's look at the annual growth rate. So here I'm describing the growth in annual sales, which is a comparison to prior year sales, as opposed to the market's share, which counts how many EVs were sold compared to the entire auto market in a given year. The US experienced more than 50% growth in EV sales in 2023. It's likely, based on Q1 growth rates, dealer inventory levels, everything we have seen in the news, that the annual rate of increase in 2024 will be lower than last year's impressive 50%. But that is in line with what the modelers expected in their forecasts. The growth of EV sales slows as this product moves from the fringes of the market more into the mainstream, and those high growth rates just become harder to sustain. But nevertheless, as long as growth remains within the range of 30 to 40% this year, it's projected to align with US climate goals. And for 2027 to 2023, you'll see that the growth rate is projected to slow further to 15 to 27%. Next slide, please. So turning to the power sector, the second largest source of US emissions, we're looking at annual clean electricity capacity additions. Last year, the US added a record 32.3 gigawatts of electric capacity to the grid from solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and the other sources that you see on this slide. That's great news. It's in part because in many parts of the country, tax credits provided by the IRA are making renewable sources of electricity cheaper to build than more polluting sources like coal or natural gas. Digging into the categories of clean electricity, solar and storage look great, and wind is a little bit more discouraging. So the US grid added more than 18 gigawatts of net summer capacity for solar PV energy last year, and that is on track with projected outcomes, and 6.4 gigawatts of battery storage, which exceeds the model expectations. Wind installs lagged behind post-IRA scenarios at 6.4 gigawatts, and that's down from a peak of 14.6 gigawatts of new wind capacity added in 2020. It's also below 2018 levels. The 2023 decline is primarily due to a drop in new onshore wind projects, which fell below, and those slowing wind installations do threaten our progress under the IRA and signal that more action on transmission may be needed. I'm sure we're going to hear more on that from today's other speakers. So next slide, please. Sort of zooming out and looking at how total clean electricity capacity additions compare to previous years, we see that record expansion in 2023 is unfortunately not good enough. In the context of where we need to be to meet US climate goals, the slide is sort of like the power sector is flashing a big warning sign that we're off track. The IRA implementation modeling had projected that 46 to 79 gigawatts of new zero carbon power would come online next year, but the SIM database tracked only 32.3 gigawatts of new capacity that actually did. On the bright side, that's 32% more than was added in 2022, when there was a significant downturn in US clean energy, and slightly more than the previous record in 2021. But to remain on course with those 2023 to 2024 projections, the US is going to have to add between 60 and 127 gigawatts of capacity this year. Currently, the SIM is tracking 60 gigawatts of clean electricity capacity under development with a scheduled start date in 2024, which would be just enough to hit the bottom end of that range. But projected start dates at this time of year have a tendency to slip later in the calendar, which does make it likely that the full year 2024 number for capacity additions will end up coming in considerably low. Beyond 2024, to meet climate targets, clean energy installation should increase even further to between 70 and 126 gigawatts a year in 2025 to 2030. That equates to installing more than double the amount of clean energy added in 2023 every year going forward. Next slide, please. So summing up, key takeaways here. Transportation, our biggest source of US emissions, ZEV deployment is on track and likely to remain on track even if sales growth slows this year. In the power sector, federal legislation has successfully closed the cost gap for clean energy, but achieving greenhouse gas reductions is contingent on building clean infrastructure at a really unprecedented pace and scale, and we need to accelerate progress in this arena. That means addressing non-cost barriers like siting and permitting, interconnection queues, and supply chain challenges will be really essential. And I'm so excited to hear from the next speakers about how we're going to get there. But that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hannah. We can move on to the next slide and the next. That was a really great setup for our next couple of speakers. Charles Harper is the Power Sector Senior Policy Lead at Evergreen Action. He's dedicated his career to achieving ambitious climate action at the federal and state levels, and has previously worked with the American Clean Power Association, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy. He'll be presenting alongside Daniela Schulman, who is a power sector consultant for Evergreen Action, where she advances state and federal policies to tackle the climate crisis and build a just and thriving clean energy economy. And I will hand it over to the two of you to get into a bit of a deep dive on one of the barriers that Hannah mentioned under the large umbrella of state siting and permitting challenges. So I'll hand it over to the two of you, and we can go to the next slide for your presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Kristen, and thanks y'all for joining. As Kristen mentioned, we're at Evergreen Action, which is a national climate-focused nonprofit org. So today we're talking about the importance of transmission lines and siting and permitting timelines for the clean energy transition, in particular, the huge opportunity that state level siting and permitting reforms present for deploying clean energy faster. As we just learned, right now we're not on track to deploy at the speeds we need. Many of the recommendations we'll talk about today come from an Evergreen Action report that Danny and I published in December called Warp Speed Clean Energy, Expediting Permitting and Equitable Grid Deployment, which we can share a link to in the chat. Next slide, please. All right, so to hit our climate targets, we need to build transmission and renewables a lot faster at a pace and scale our country's scarcely seen before. So with all these great bills in Congress like IRA, IIJA, CHIPS and Science, the cost picture is looking much better. Our climate goals are closer and within reach in a way they've never been before. But there's a big bottleneck, which is the lack of the transmission grid that could connect these resources to where they're needed. So to hit our climate targets, a lot of estimates, including from Princeton University, have shown we need to double the pace of transmission growth and quadruple the pace of renewable energy growth by the end of the decade. And we need to do it no matter who's in the White House, and in the face of ongoing resistance from some folks in Congress, climate deniers who aren't down with the transition. So we believe that shortening timelines for federal environmental review through Congress is a false solution. A lot of folks have been talking about permitting reforms in Congress that might skid the tracks for fossil fuel projects and pipelines, but that's not, in our view, the real issue. The real issue is the climate crisis and the need to deploy clean energy faster, not permitting reforms for all energy technologies. So this report that we'll talk about today talks about some of these non-congressional reforms, including especially at the state level to siting and permitting for clean energy and transmission that can help without helping fossil fuels or eroding equity or procedural justice. So we're going to talk about now what we can do through executive action and state policy. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a timeline showing what a typical permitting process for a clean energy project might look like. Challenges and slowdowns can arise at any point along this multi-year process, from acquiring land to financing a project to getting it through lengthy interconnection queues. Major clean energy projects often need to secure permits from federal government, from local government, and state government, all of which can struggle with budgeting and staffing constraints and interagency coordination. So some research from Columbia Law School Sabin Center for Climate Law, MIT, and UC Santa Barbara's Leah Stokes all show that local opposition to clean energy is widespread and on the rise, and can lead to years-long delays in all of these crucial permitting steps. So often conversation has narrowed to NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and some of those technology neutral fixes in Congress through permitting reform that can also hasten fossil fuel projects, but that's not acceptable, and clearly the problem is much more complex. So in this paper that we're discussing, we developed a set of policy recs that can address numerous sources of delay proactively and comprehensively, grouped in 3 categories. Next slide, please. So that the first category is transmission reforms through Congress. So through federal agencies and executive action, not through Congress. So some of these can serve as inspiration to states that are considering their own permitting reforms. The federal government, the Biden administration, is really on the cutting edge at looking at how a transmission and clean energy can be built and approved faster in a way that maintains community input. So the first category is within FERC. So this is a big opportunity for states and RTOs and other folks who maintain the grid, operate the grid. FERC next Thursday is set to finalize a major blockbuster rule around transmission planning. So next Thursday, it's going to finally finalize this rule that's been 2 years in the works, that will require utilities and RTOs and other grid planners to proactively plan the transmission grid for the future and consider all the benefits that transmission can bring, including reducing constraints on the grid, increasing reliability, bringing low-cost power online in a way that provides a huge opportunity to folks in the states, utilities and RTOs, to make sure that's implemented well and actually leading to the massive transmission and grid build out that we need. The second set of reforms are at DOE. So DOE is pursuing a few rules right now, including a key rule that will make DOE the lead coordinating agency to expedite siting and permitting. That's something that states can take inspiration from and pursue something similarly at the state level, setting one key agency to lead all permitting efforts for clean energy and transmission projects, and really taking that interagency coordination problem head on. So that's the, it's called 216H or CITAP. If you're in the weeds of DOE rules and want to learn more about it, I'm also happy to answer more questions. So that's on the transmission piece. The second category of reforms, if we could go to the next slide, is about environmental permitting. So folks have probably heard of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, but states often have very similar state level laws. There's something called little NEPAs. You might have heard of CEQA, which is the California version of NEPA. A lot of other states have these as well. The federal government is similarly providing a lot of really great examples of how these environmental permitting statutes and review processes can be improved for clean energy and transmission. So right now, the White House Council on Environmental Quality is finalizing a rule on NEPA implementation, which removes some of the ill-advised changes under the Trump administration and works to better consider climate change and the benefits to carbon emissions that clean energy projects could bring, and improve some of the processes around environmental justice and input from EJ communities. So that's one great federal example that states could look to if they're looking to reform their own little NEPA processes. And then the second category of reforms is done by the federal permitting agencies themselves. So the first is expanded programmatic environmental impact statements. So PEIS is the acronym for it, but essentially these programmatic EISs conduct a larger landscape level analysis of what an environmental impact from a type of project might be. So That saves time later down the process because each individual project environmental assessment can refer to the previous higher level programmatic one, which can reduce redundancies and speed up timelines. So that's something states can implement as well. One great example is the California Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan. So this was developed in conjunction with federal agencies. It's an off-cited example that significantly reduced permitting time for solar projects in California desert ecosystems that allowed these projects to protect species and ecosystems and speed up timelines. So a real win-win. Next slide, please.
All right,
right.
I'll take it from here. Thank you, Charles. Next, we're going to do a deep dive into states, the barriers and some opportunities. A lot of the challenges Charles just went over at the federal level have their equivalents at the local and the state levels. So if poorly coordinated, local siting and permitting can multiply administrative burden, it can spur local opposition, and it can increase the likelihood of project delay or outright cancellation. To avoid these challenges, states can pass laws that both streamline clean energy siting and permitting and ensure that clear and visible benefits are flowing to host communities. We are going to walk through a menu of recommendations. All of these are included in more depth in that report that I threw in the chat. As we go through it, just keep in mind, siting and permitting operate differently across state lines. There's no single solution that is going to work everywhere. And a lot of these recommendations can and should be considered in tandem. So first up, as Charles mentioned, like DOE is set to do at the federal level, states can designate one lead agency to better coordinate review. This could be a public utility commission, this could be an environmental department, it could be a built-for-purpose siting board or siting office. Next, we recommend that states set reasonable and transparent timelines. As we know from Hannah's excellent presentation, the climate crisis is here, and clean energy deployment is not currently on pace to help us decarbonize the power sector. To succeed, we think states should set reasonable timelines that go hand in hand with increased coordination, staff capacity, and upfront planning. Laws like this would need to allow ample time for meaningful early community input and robust tribal consultation. Next, we recommend states guard against local obstruction. This could look like, there's many different ways this could look. States could shift siting authority from local to the state level, or they could exercise backstop authority only when localities unjustifiably deny permits or fail to approve them on time. States also have the option of establishing opt-in programs, which stops short of replacing local approval, but still gives clean energy and transmission developers the option of an expedited review process. Next, we recommend states work to minimize and address adverse impacts or even provide net conservation benefits. States could do this by requiring upfront analysis of clean energy infrastructure. Goes back to those programmatic EISs that you could do for clean energy technologies. You could map out zones to consider favoring or avoiding, and you could set statewide standards like setback rules, noise limits, height restrictions. All of these requirements should be influenced by input from affected and disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. All right. We also strongly encourage states to require community benefits agreements, or CBAs. CBAs are enforceable contracts that commit developers to providing specific local benefits. The benefits in a CBA could include lots of different things: local hiring guarantees, job training programs, discounts on energy bills, or local infrastructure investments in things like bike paths or community centers. It'll look different everywhere, and to be effective, CBAs should be designed together by a representative set of stakeholders to address specific local needs. Next, states should require upfront consultation with tribes that is much more than a box-checking exercise. Engagement should include Indigenous peoples both with and without federal recognition, and should extend beyond governing bodies to reach all the members of an affected tribal community. Project stakeholders should respect tribal sovereignty and cultural resources and abide by treaty rights. In short, States should be engaging with tribes at the same level that they would engage with another sovereign nation. We also encourage states to require cumulative impact analysis. This would give permitting agencies a requirement to consider a proposed project in the area in context. So what's the existing infrastructure? What's the community composition? What's the environment? And it would apply not just to clean energy and transmission, but also to polluting fossil fuel projects. New Jersey's environmental justice law is a really great example of this type of legislation. In New Jersey, if a proposed project is found to cause a disproportionate burden, its permit has to be denied, which makes sure that cumulative impact analysis is not a box-checking exercise. And last but not least, states should require early and meaningful engagement with affected communities. They should prioritize overburdened and underserved communities from the earliest stages of planning. And agencies and developers should both be required to engage openly and transparently and plan with local residents. We recommend that state laws also establish dedicated funding streams for intervenor compensation. This makes sure that engagement is more accessible for everybody. Next slide, please. So in our Warp Speed report, we have deep dives on a bunch of different states that have already taken action to reform the permitting process for renewables and/or transmission. We're really excited about recent success in Michigan that reforms siting for wind, solar, storage, and associated transmission. And if you want to dive deeper, again, check out our report. It has a lot of details that we're not going to be able to get to today. But just a few things I wanted to highlight. In both Michigan and California, we see a lead agency offering an opt-in process that seeks to limit or requires making a decision within 1 year. We also see in those states really strong requirements for community benefits agreements and community engagement. In Illinois, you see a different approach. The state chose to retain county siting authority over wind and solar, but set statewide rules that counties cannot further restrict. And then in Washington, my home state, you see the Department of Ecology designated as the lead agency. And crucially, they've been allocated $30 million in additional funding to help increase capacity and to administer grants to tribal communities to support their engagement in the review process. Ecology also has to conduct 3 of those programmatic environmental impact statements for clean technologies. We're excited about this. It would identify impacts and mitigation measures and make it easier to conduct those project level reviews. Next slide. All right, so in summary, if you are a state policymaker or advocate looking to advance clean energy siting and permitting reform, these 10 considerations are key. I don't need to read them all out. They're right there for you to see. And again, they're in our report, but it's a nice, pretty list for everyone to refer to. Next slide. And I saved this one for last, just because we're excited about a bill that is currently under consideration this session in New York. Back in 2020, there was some legislation passed that established a first of its kind Office of Renewable Energy Siting. This is called ORES. It's the lead agency for renewables permitting. And this current bill, the RAPID Act, would essentially expand ORES to also permit transmission projects. This is really key. As Charles explained at the top of our presentation, wind and solar has to go hand in hand with the poles and wires that deliver it to our homes and to our businesses. There is truly no transition without transmission. So the RAPID Act would let ORES permit power lines. It would require proof of consultation with local governments, establish intervenor funds for community members, establish statewide uniform standards that have to net benefit endangered species and habitat. Overall, we think the RAPID Act would do a good job of hitting this balance, safeguarding the environment, preserving local input, and at the same time, cutting the timeline for transmission projects by more than half. And I will pass it back to Charles on the next slide to close us out.
Thanks, Danny. So As folks here know, the IRA has given us a once-in-a-lifetime, once-in-a-generation opportunity to jolt the clean energy transition. But some of these outdated laws and permitting and planning processes are holding back the transition. So the point here is not to shorten permitting timelines writ large, but rather to meet the urgency of the climate crisis and these clean energy deployment timelines to build clean infrastructure faster and reduce our fossil fuel dependency while strengthening community input and benefits and protecting overburdened communities. So states here have a huge opportunity to reform their siting and permitting processes in a way that benefits communities and ecosystems and spurs clean energy deployment to meet our climate challenge. So we're seeing legislation at both the federal and state levels that would help us make the most of our existing power lines as well. So there's some bills that would incentivize and require consideration of grid enhancing technologies or GETs, which allows us to use existing transmission faster. So that's another opportunity, but on all fronts, whether it's unlocking the capacity of existing lines or removing barriers to building out new transmission, we want to achieve warp speed clean energy. If we do, then states must step on the accelerator. But if you want to take more action on this front, you could review or uplift our warp speed clean energy paper, or if you're in New York State, potentially call your legislator on the Rapid Act. But thanks all so much for your time and attention. I'll turn it back to you, Kristen.
Thanks so much, Charles and Danny. That was great. That report is in the chat, but feel free to send it again for folks. We can go to the next slide, and we will talk more about some grid mod policies, grid modernization as part of this larger transmission issue. We have David Sarkisian, who's a principal policy analyst at the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center. David contributes to the 50 states of solar, 50 states of grid modernization, and 50 states of electric vehicles reports, as well as the team's other Desire, DSIRE, Insight subscription services. And so I will hand it over to David. We can go to the next slide to start your presentation.
Hello, everybody. So my name is David Sarkisian. We're going to go over some of the barriers to clean energy and some of the grid modernization policies and technologies that can help to address some of those barriers. All right, you can go to the next slide. But just a little bit about where I work is the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center. So I'm on the policy team there, and although we're called the NC Clean Energy Technology Center, and we do a lot of work in North Carolina, our main project for the policy team has been the database of state incentives for renewables and efficiency, Desire, which has a national scope. So for our Desire work and then some of the subscription services, we go over the whole country. So next slide, please. So a lot of the information I'm going to share for you comes from our 50 States of Grid Modernization report. We also have our distributed solar report, our EV report, and more recently we've added a decarbonization policy report. All right, next slide. All right, so what do we mean by grid modernization? It's kind of a nebulous term, and I think you would get different answers depending on who you talk to, but included in the scope of our reports are just any actions making the electricity system more resilient, responsive, and interactive. And the specific items that we cover are smart grid technologies and advanced metering infrastructure, utility business model reform, regulatory reform, utility rate reform and rate design, and then anything to do with energy storage, microgrids, or demand response. Next slide. All right, so some of the barriers to clean energy and grid modernization solutions that I'll go over here. One barrier is access to wholesale markets. And some of the progress that's been going on in grid modernization policy has to do with clean energy interconnection, distributed energy resource aggregation, and wholesale market expansion. Then when we talk about incorporation of variable resources, we can see progress in deployment of smart grid technologies and energy storage, use of time of use rates, and then advances in DER compensation. And then lastly, we have consideration of DER and planning processes. And I guess beyond DER, we should also include utility scale resources, utility scale energy storage, and the like. And then separate categories here are integrated resource planning, distribution system planning, and then advances in utility business models, including performance-based rate making. All right, next slide. So the first barrier we're going to talk about is access to wholesale markets. I think a lot of you would know that have clean energy projects have historically had some difficulty connecting to the wholesale markets, and this is in the regions where they even exist. Some market rules have really not been equipped or were not intended to handle the characteristics of clean energy resources, like the variability of solar and wind energy, as well as the different services that energy storage can provide, even though it's not technically a generation resource. And then, as the other presenters have mentioned, there have been major interconnection backlogs due to the volume of new resources coming on the market. So some rule changes at FERC and wholesale market expansions can help to address some of these issues. Next slide. So this is actually fairly long ago now, but probably the first big FERC order on energy storage was Order 841, which would aim to get access to wholesale markets for energy storage. I think this came out in 2018, and the various ISOs and RTOs have largely implemented this now. And a more recent FERC order that just came out last year is Order 2023, which reformed interconnection processes. Now, some of the changes that have come from that is that we now review projects in batches using a cluster study approach rather than reviewing projects one at a time. It adopts a first ready, first served system rather than a first come, first served system for projects connecting. It adopts some stricter rules for projective interconnecting customers to prevent speculative projects. It allows resources such as solar and storage to co-locate behind a single point of interconnection, and dipping into transmission requires consideration of alternative transmission technology from the ISOs and RTOs. All right, next slide. Another big FERC order that came out was on the topic of DER aggregation. So this is someone along the lines of virtual power plants, if people have heard of that concept. But basically, small DERs can be aggregated to a resource scale that allows meaningful participation in wholesale markets. And FERC Order 2222 back in 2020 aimed to ensure access to wholesale markets for these DER aggregators. Some of the various wholesale markets have been kind of slow in implementing this order. And we've seen like MISO and PJM had tried to delay it even well into the latter part of the decade, but have been somewhat pushed back by FERC on that. Another element of that that's interesting is that it left in place the state opt-out for demand response aggregators, and a few states have, not to this date, allowed demand response aggregators to participate in wholesale markets. Although last year we saw Missouri decided to opt in to allowing DER or demand response aggregators to participate. Another small part of that is determining whether to allow demand response or DER aggregators to participate dually in both retail and wholesale markets. Some states have allowed that, and some states have been more reluctant out of concerns about double counting or things like that. I think generally the preferred approach is more to allow the dual participation if the technology exists for it. All right, and next slide, please. And another trend we've seen that can enable more clean energy participation is expansion of the wholesale markets to new areas. We've seen expansion from the California ISO through things like with the Western Energy Imbalance Market, which has incorporated other states and regions outside of California. And now they're looking to also do an expanded day-ahead market, which would kind of increase the market activities that can be participated in there. The Southwest Power Pool is also expanded and is also looking to have an expanded day-ahead market called Markets Plus. And then in the Southeast, we've had SEAM come up. You can see various opinions on the utility of this market, and it's hit some snags in the courts on determining whether it will go forward, but it does show some, at least, attention to this issue in the Southeast where there aren't otherwise wholesale markets. And then we also saw South Carolina at the state level considering participation in wholesale markets. So that's another route forward in the Southeast, perhaps. All right, next slide, please. So incorporation of variable resources can also be a barrier that grid modernization technologies can address. And some of this comes from the characteristics of the resources themselves, and some of it comes from utility rate structures that just aren't equipped to handle some of those characteristics. All right, next slide. Some of the smart grid technologies that can address this include advanced metering infrastructure, which can facilitate a more accurate compensation of DERs, and then also allows things like residential demand response programs and direct load management programs where the utilities can directly manage demand response resources like HVAC and hopefully provide the customers some compensation up front for that. Some utilities have been installing things called distributed energy resource management systems, which are more utility level technologies that enables them to incorporate the attributes of DERs at the distribution system level. And then microgrids allowed DERs to be used to provide some resilient services. All right, next slide. Energy storage can facilitate variable resources. We've seen a lot of policy developments on this. 10 states currently have energy storage targets, and Maryland and Michigan are the most recent ones to adopt these. You also see some incentives for distributed level storage. Illinois has these in the form of rebates provided to distributed storage, as well as distributed generation that can provide compensation for the inverter and grid services that these resources provide. California has the self-generated generation incentive program. And I should also mention there's several other states with these that I'm not covering all of them. North Carolina has recently adopted the Power Pair incentive program for solar paired with storage as well. Right, move on. Next slide, please. Time of use rates are a rate structure that can reward DER for providing energy services at peak times. Some states have been moving to residential time of use rates, although there's been some pushback to that, as we've seen in Missouri last year, where they had to move back on the scale of the rate differences for different time periods. In addition to just rates that change based on particular times, you can include things like critical peak pricing, which is a rates particular incentives for generating at particular peak times, which may happen on separate days, or real-time pricing based on more on wholesale market prices rather than defined in the rate prices. All right, next slide, please. DER compensation. I think the most common thing that we talk about with this is net metering. So that's obviously been a point of controversy in a lot of states over the years. But hopefully we've been moving to some more sophisticated and accurate rate structures for that over time, leaving out any of the controversy over the sometimes more, should I put it, or less targeted changes that some states have tried to make to net metering. Illinois has moved to, as I mentioned earlier, to providing compensation for the services that inverters can provide. And another example is Hawaii, which has separate net metering rates depending on what customers want to do with their storage, whether they want to use it to provide grid services or just use it to supplement their distributed generation. All right, next slide. And the last category I want to go over is planning processes and utility business model changes. And these can require more thorough consideration of clean energy resources in utility planning processes. And in utility business model changes, they can be given incentives through performance-based rate making for more incorporation of clean energy. All right, next slide. So we see in utility integrated resource plans that energy storage is playing a much larger role than it did in previous periods. Also, more states are requiring or considering legislation to require integrated resource plans. One of the more recent states to do this was Delaware, which adopted it at the state level last year. And we also see that IRPs are being required to align with state clean energy policies. We saw this in Michigan's big bill last year. All right, next slide. Distribution system planning processes can motivate utilities to consider things beyond traditional grid investments, such as non-wires alternatives and energy storage on the distribution system. We've seen some states have pushed back on utility distribution system plans. We saw in Illinois grid plans get rejected for being too costly and not addressing some of Illinois' climate policy goals sufficiently. So there's always a balance between incorporating these new technologies and trying to maintain cost control and affordability. All right, next slide. And then the last element to talk about is performance-based rate making utility business models. You can induce more interconnection of DERs directly through performance metrics. And then these can also provide incentives for energy efficiency, demand response, and more incorporation of energy storage. And we saw both North Carolina had adopted PBR last year, and Connecticut is considering new PBR rules as well. All right, I think that's it for me. Can go to the next slide, but just as questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, David. We can go ahead to the next slide, which I think is just Q&A. Yeah, so we can stop screen sharing now. We have a few minutes left here at the end of the hour. Thank you to all our presenters, but I'm gonna steamroll ahead into some questions here. So we have one question on CBA's, community benefit agreements. So are there steps or approaches to ensure that community benefit agreements aren't used or perceived as a tool to influence communities to accept harm or impacts that they would otherwise not agree to?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that one on, Kristen. I think that's a great question because, if poorly designed, CBAs can really let communities down, and they can be, little more than a payoff that looks from the outside like developers are just using their resources to site where they want to. I think ideally CBAs should be the end result of a really robust and meaningful community-oriented process. So what it comes down to is, what does the structure of the agreement look like, and what steps did you take to get there? I'm in California, and UC Berkeley's law school actually just released a great report on CBAs and offshore wind, which is a hot topic in our state. I'll drop the link to the chat. That's a great external resource where you can learn about all of those things, like what makes a good, strong CBA.
Great, thank you so much. We have another question here about environmental opposition to transmission lines. I don't know if any of you have advice or models that you've seen working well in terms of, some of that opposition to transmission lines related to environmental impacts. It's a tough one.
That one is really tough. I guess the challenge with transmission, as opposed to clean energy projects, is that oftentimes communities might not see the direct benefit of the line itself, especially for long distance or interstate lines. Say a transmission line is connecting a wind farm in Oklahoma to power in Arizona. it passes through New Mexico, but New Mexico doesn't see a benefit directly from the electricity. That can make siting those types of projects difficult. So there have been a few approaches that developers have been looking at, states have been looking at. A few include like some substations along the way that ensure that some of the power is being shared with communities it's passing through, or community benefits agreements like Danny just discussed that ensures that there's some tax benefit or job creation or revenue for communities that are the home base for some of these long distance transmission projects. But it is really difficult. There's some solutions, obviously, with undergrounding transmission lines or looking at grid enhancing technologies that can reduce the need for new transmission, but we are going to need a lot of new build transmission to achieve all of our climate goals, and siting will continually be an issue. I guess like one thing I would say as an environmental person who likes transmission is that transmission lines, unlike fossil fuel projects, aren't killing folks and causing cancer and asthma in communities. It's usually a visual impact, which can be real, but is not necessarily the same category of impact that some of these polluting facilities will have. But it's a tough one for sure, and lots of folks are grappling with it every day.
And I would just jump in to add that, you know, opposition is not a monolith. So I think trying to tackle it head on takes a really targeted approach. You know, are community members upset about, a real impact, or are they being absolutely buried in misinformation that needs to be countered by, you know, experts, state agencies? Often in these projects, also the people that community members interact with the most are developers. And I think there's room for both state policymakers and advocates to play a bigger role here. There's actually some great organizing in the works to try to create more of like please greenlight clean energy infrastructure in my community. I think the people you hear from the most are the folks who are going to die on the hill opposing it. So we want more people to come forward saying they want a renewable energy transition that's going to provide, you know, family sustaining jobs in their community. And then states too can be there separately and also alongside developers, so that you're not just hearing from the big corporate world about what's going to happen and the changes that are going to come. Of course, caveat, you can't get rid of all opposition, right? You can do everything you can take all the right steps. At the end of the day, you can't convince everybody.
Thank you, Danny and Charles. Thank you, Hannah and David, for your amazing presentations. We are right at the top of the hour here, so I'm going to start closing us out. Thank you so much for your time, attendees as well. As usual, a recap article and the recording and slides will be sent out by late this week. And you can reach out to me. I sent my email in the chat, but you also have it from registering for this. Kristen@climate-exchange.org. If you have any questions, you want to be in contact with any speakers, you need links. And then, I put the link in the chat to sign up for our SCPN call next week, which is a monthly national call where states give updates on what's been happening in climate policy in recent months. Thank you again to everyone. Transmission is definitely a big and scary beast, but I think there are best practices, there's lessons learned from the federal and state levels that we can really target and scale in ways that make a difference for the time scale that we need. So thank you to everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Enjoy the springtime. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.